What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about a mother's love, and the lengths people will go for money, or maybe for something else entirely. This is one of those stories that still gives me chills when I think about it. I'll never forget the first time I saw life return to Eleanor Richardson's eyes. The 89-year-old woman sat in her wheelchair, staring at the man in front of her. But her gaze was different. There was a light in her eyes I hadn't seen in the last 30 years. That morning, everything changed. Eleanor Richardson was the richest woman in our town. She lived off the $50 million fortune left by her husband Walter's oil company. But money meant nothing to her. Since she lost her son David in 1994, Eleanor had just been breathing, not living. When the doorbell rang that morning, the housekeeper Maria answered as usual, but the man at the door, my God, he looked so much like David that Maria's knees started shaking. The same blue eyes, the same jaw structure. Even the small scar on the left corner of his lip was identical. The man introduced himself as David Richardson. David Richardson, who had been missing for 30 years, who everyone knew was dead. He said he wanted to see Eleanor. Maria called me in panic. I was Eleanor's niece and handled all her affairs. When I rushed to the house, Eleanor had already started talking to the man. They were sitting in the living room. Eleanor's hands were trembling, but there was such happiness on her face. She was smiling for the first time in 30 years. Before we continue with this incredible story, hit that subscribe button for more unbelievable true stories that will leave you speechless. The man knew everything. David's treehouse where he fell when he was 7. His dog Rusty's death. The Italian lullaby Eleanor sang to him every night before bed. He even shared secrets that only David and his mother knew. Things nobody else could possibly know. I immediately tried to intervene. This had to be a scam. It had to be. I had buried David's body. I had read the police reports. He couldn't have survived that car accident. But Eleanor wasn't listening to me. Her eyes were only on that man. The man calmly turned to me and mentioned a detail even I didn't know. He said there was a hidden compartment behind the closet in David's room that nobody knew about, and David's diary was hidden there. I ran upstairs. I pushed the closet, and there it was, really there, pages filled with David's handwriting in a dusty notebook. Eleanor started crying. My son, is it really you? She whispered. The man held Eleanor's hands and said, Mom, I finally came home. At that moment, Eleanor's heart could have stopped from happiness, but it didn't. Instead, it was as if 30 years of mourning had suddenly ended. Family members started arriving one by one. After hearing the news, my brother Thomas was furious. This is insane. David is dead. We all saw his funeral, he shouted. Our cousins were in shock. Some wanted to believe. Some absolutely refused. The man, without any panic, told everyone personal memories about David. He told Thomas about the fishing trip they took together in 1992, how Thomas fell in the water, and David saved him. Thomas's face went white because only he and David knew this story. But I was still suspicious. I said we needed to do a DNA test. The man didn't object at all. Of course, he said calmly. I'll do whatever it takes for my mother's peace of mind. That night, Eleanor wanted to sleep in David's old room for the first time in 30 years. The man stayed in the next room. In the middle of the night, I heard sounds from Eleanor's room. When I cracked open the door, I saw Eleanor hugging that man and crying. I missed you so much, son. Every day, every hour, I thought of you, she was saying. The next morning, we went to the hospital for the DNA test. Dr. Klein was Eleanor's family friend of 40 years. He personally conducted the test. He said the results would come in 48 hours. During those 48 hours, the house was literally divided in two. One side believed this man was David. The other side insisted he was definitely a fraud. The man was very calm during this time. He spent hours with Eleanor. They looked through old photo albums. He told stories from David's childhood. I heard Eleanor's laughter that I hadn't heard in years. The woman had practically been reborn. But things were about to get even more complicated. The second night, while everyone was asleep, I decided to do my own investigation. I snuck into the man's room and went through his belongings. What I found made my blood run cold. He had documents, lots of them, medical records, psychiatric evaluations, and photographs of David from angles I'd never seen before. But the most disturbing thing was a letter written in David's handwriting, dated just 1 week before his supposed death. The letter read, "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Trust no one, especially not Uncle Richard." Uncle Richard was Eleanor's brother-in-law, who had died 5 years ago from a heart attack, or at least that's what we were told. The next morning, I confronted the man privately. He looked at me with those eerily familiar blue eyes and said something that made my skin crawl. "Sarah, I know you were only 12 when it happened, but you saw something that night, didn't you?" At the hospital, my heart stopped. I had never told anyone what I saw at the hospital the night David died. I was there with my parents, and I had snuck away to find a vending machine. I saw Uncle Richard in the corridor, talking to someone in scrubs. They were exchanging something minimal, and then Richard said, "Make sure the body is unrecognizable." I was young and scared. I never said anything. I convinced myself I had misunderstood. But now, this man, this supposed David, knew about it. "How do you know about that?" I whispered. He pulled out another document. It was a medical report from a hospital in Mexico, dated 2 years after David's death. The patient's name was blacked out, but the injuries described matched exactly what David would have sustained in the accident. The patient had survived, but with severe amnesia and facial reconstruction surgery. "I didn't remember anything for years," he said. "They told me my name was Michael. I lived in Mexico, worked as a translator, but then 3 years ago, I started having dreams, memories, a woman singing an Italian lullaby, a big house with white columns, a mother who loved me more than life itself." Eleanor had been listening from the doorway. I hadn't heard her wheelchair approaching. The look on her face wasn't surprise. It was recognition. "I knew it," she said. "A mother knows. I felt it in my bones that you weren't really gone." Thomas burst in then, waving his phone. "The DNA results came early," he announced. "Dr. Klein called me directly." He paused, his face pale. "It's a match. This is David." The room exploded. Some family members were crying. Others were shouting that it was impossible. But I noticed something. The man, David, didn't look relieved. He looked sad. "There's more," he said quietly. Everyone fell silent. "I came back for Mom, yes, but also for justice. Uncle Richard didn't work alone. The accident was staged. They wanted the inheritance, but they didn't count on me surviving." Eleanor's face hardened. Richard always resented Walter for being more successful. "But I never thought." She turned to Thomas. "Your father knew something, didn't he? That's why he and Richard stopped talking right before David's accident." Thomas nodded slowly. "Dad found discrepancies in the company books. Richard had been embezzling. He told me years later, but by then Richard was dead, and Dad thought it was better to let it go." But David shook his head. "Richard wasn't working alone. Someone in this room helped him. Someone who's been managing your finances for 30 years, Eleanor. Someone who made sure you never looked too closely at where your money was going." All eyes turned to Marcus, Eleanor's financial advisor and Thomas's best friend. He had been standing in the corner, silent until now. His face was sweating. "That's ridiculous," Marcus stammered. I've been loyal to this family for decades. David pulled out a final document. Then explain why you've been sending monthly payments to a private account in the Cayman Islands. The same account Richard used. The same account that's been paying for the medical care of a patient in Mexico for 30 years. Marcus tried to run, but Thomas grabbed him. The police were called. As they led Marcus away, he finally confessed. Richard had promised him a cut of the inheritance if they got rid of David. But when David survived, Marcus had to keep paying the Mexican hospital to keep him there, sedated and confused, while telling them he had no family. But the body, I said. We buried someone. David's expression darkened. A homeless man. Richard found someone, with no family, no one to miss him. The fire made identification impossible, except for the items, my wallet, my watch, my ring, all planted. Eleanor was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. My boy survived, you survived, and you found your way home. But the story wasn't over. That night, as we were all trying to process everything, Eleanor called me to her room. David was there too. Sarah, Eleanor said, there's something else. I've known Marcus was stealing for years. I let him because I had nothing to live for anyway. But I hired a private investigator 5 years ago. I knew David might be alive. I was stunned. You knew. She nodded. Not for certain, but a mother's heart. I never gave up hope. The investigator found traces, someone matching David's description in Mexico. Medical records that didn't add up. Payments Marcus couldn't explain. I've been waiting, hoping that somehow my son would find his way back. David knelt beside his mother's wheelchair, tears streaming down his face. All these years you never gave up on me? Never, Eleanor said firmly. Not for a single day. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The media got hold of the story. Dead son returns. The 30 years murder plot. Exposed headlines screamed. Marcus was charged with attempted murder, fraud, and embezzlement. He eventually confessed to everything, including how Richard had planned it all. But the most shocking revelation came during Marcus's trial. He revealed that there were others involved, prominent members of the community who had invested in Richard's scheme, expecting to get a piece of Eleanor's fortune once David was gone, and Eleanor died of grief. The list included the town mayor, the chief of police who had handled David's accident case, and even Dr. Klein. That's why the DNA results had come back early. Klein had been trying to warn Marcus that the truth was about to come out. One by one, they all fell. The corruption ran so deep that state investigators had to take over. Our quiet town was turned upside down. But through it all, Eleanor seemed stronger than ever. Having David back had given her a reason to fight. But not everyone believed the story. Some people whispered that this was all an elaborate con, that the real David was still dead, and this man had somehow fooled everyone, including the DNA test. They pointed out inconsistencies. How could someone survive such injuries? How could amnesia last exactly until Eleanor's health started declining and she began talking about changing her will? I had my own doubts that I kept private. Late one night, I found David standing in front of the family portrait taken just months before his accident. You really don't remember anything from those years in Mexico? I asked. He turned to me, and for just a moment, I saw something in his eyes. Not confusion, but calculation. Then it was gone. Fragments, he said. Like a dream, you can't quite recall. David, I said carefully. If you're not really David, if this is all some elaborate scheme, I need to know. Eleanor's heart can't take another loss. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Sarah, what makes someone who they are? Is it their DNA? Their memories? Or is it the love they carry for someone, even through decades of darkness? I may not remember every moment of being David Richardson, but I know with every fiber of my being that Eleanor is my mother. I know I would die for her. Isn't that enough? I never asked again, because I saw how Eleanor bloomed with him there. She started eating again, laughing again, living again. She even started walking short distances, something doctors said was impossible at her age. David was by her side every moment, reading to her, talking about plans for the future, making up for lost time. The fortune didn't matter to him. He signed documents, refusing any inheritance, saying he only wanted his mother. This silenced many critics, who insisted he was after money, but it raised other questions. If not money, then what? Why return now? The answer came 6 months later. Eleanor's health had improved so dramatically that doctors were calling it miraculous. She was out of the wheelchair, walking in the garden with David, when she suddenly stopped. "I need to tell you something," she said to him. "Your father's death wasn't natural," she continued. "Richard poisoned him, slowly, over months. I found out after you disappeared, but I had no proof. The police were in Richard's pocket. I've been waiting all these years for justice." David's face went pale. "Mom, I know why you really came back." Eleanor interrupted. "You remembered, didn't you? Not just me, but what they did to Walter, what they did to us." David nodded slowly. The memories came in pieces. Dad sick, Uncle Richard always there with his special tea, you crying at night, then my accident. It all connected. Eleanor smiled sadly. "You came back to expose them all, not just for you, but for Walter." "And for you," David said. "They destroyed our family. They needed to pay." As I watched them together, I realized the truth didn't matter anymore. Whether he was David returned from the dead, or someone else who had become David through shared pain and purpose, he had given Eleanor something precious: justice and peace. The trials continued for 2 years. Marcus got 25 to life. The others received various sentences. The town slowly healed from the scandal, and through it all, Eleanor and David were inseparable. Eleanor lived another 3 years after David's return. They were the happiest years I'd ever seen her have. She died peacefully in her sleep, with David holding her hand. Her last words were, "I knew you'd come home." At her funeral, hundreds came to pay respects. David stood by the grave, and I heard him whisper, "I kept my promise, Mom. They all paid for what they did. Rest now." After Eleanor's death, David disappeared. He left a note saying he needed to find himself, to discover who he was without the mission that had driven him home. The inheritance went to charity, as Eleanor had specified in her new will. Some say they've seen him in different parts of the world, helping other families find justice, exposing corruption, fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. Others say he returned to Mexico, to the life he had built there during his lost years. But I know the truth. Every year, on Eleanor's birthday, a single white rose appears on her grave. No card, no message. Just the rose, the same kind David used to pick for her from the garden when he was a child. I saw him once, 3 years after Eleanor's death. I was visiting her grave, and he was there, in the distance, watching. He looked different, older, more at peace. Our eyes met across the cemetery. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of our shared secret, then walked away. I never saw him again. But I know he's out there somewhere. The boy who died and came back, or the stranger who became a son. It doesn't matter which. What matters is that he gave an old woman her heart back, exposed a web of evil, and showed us all that sometimes justice takes decades, but it does come. Some people still debate whether he was really David Richardson. They analyze photos, compare mannerisms, argue about the DNA test, but they miss the point entirely. He was David in every way that mattered, in his love for Eleanor, in his quest for justice, in his sacrifice of any inheritance for the simple right to call her mom. The Richardson mansion stands empty now, sold to a family from out of state who don't know its history. But sometimes, when I drive by at night, I swear I can see a light in David's old room and shadows of a mother and son reunited, if only for a brief, precious time. That's the thing about truth. Sometimes, it's not about facts or DNA or proof. Sometimes, it's about love so strong it can bring someone back from the dead or create them anew. Eleanor died knowing her son had come home. David, whoever he really was, gave her that gift. And in the end, isn't that the only truth that matters? Marcus died in prison last year. On his deathbed, he made one final confession. He swore that the man who came back really was David, that he had survived, that the Mexico story was true. But then he laughed and said, or maybe I just want to believe that, because the alternative, that someone loved Eleanor enough to become her dead son, is even more frightening. We'll never know for sure. The medical records from Mexico mysteriously disappeared. The DNA samples were contaminated in a lab fire. All we have are questions and a story that seems impossible but changed everything. But I choose to believe that love can conquer death, that justice can prevail even after decades, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the lost really do find their way home. Eleanor Richardson is buried next to her husband Walter now, and beside them is an empty plot with a headstone that reads David Richardson, lost and found. Whether he'll ever occupy that plot, or whether it will remain empty forever, a monument to a mystery that defined our town, only time will tell. But every year, on the anniversary of his return, I leave 2 roses on Eleanor's grave, one from me, and one for the son who loved her enough to come back from the dead, in whatever form that took.